somewhere behind German NATO lines, a Cold War scenario the Soviet Union planned for in meticulous detail. A Spetsnaz reconnaissance team has been operating for 72 hours. 2 men, no radio contact since insertion. Their objective is a specific telephone cable junction 3 kilometers behind the forward edge of the battle area, the kind of fixed installation that would route communications between artillery batteries and their command posts. They have already eliminated 1 sentry with a blade. The second sentry is 15 meters away, facing partially toward them, positioned in a way that closes off the approach. A knife throw is possible, but not reliable at this distance. A conventional firearm is out of the question. The sound would compromise the entire operation. The PSS silent pistol is the correct weapon, but one of the men left his in the stream crossing when they had to swim 30 meters of freezing water and a seal on the holster failed. What he still has, attached to his hip and completely waterproof, is a knife. It weighs 570 grams. It is 290 millimeters long. It looks, to any observer who does not know what they are looking at, like a military utility knife with a slightly oversized handle. It is not. The handle contains a 60mm rifled barrel, a firing mechanism, a cocking lever, a manual safety, and a single round of 7.6242mm SP4 captive piston ammunition that will, when fired, produce approximately 122 decibels of sound, quieter than a domestic air conditioning unit, no muzzle flash, and no detectable gas signature. The scenario is hypothetical. The weapon is not. This is the NRS-2, Noj Razvedchika Strelia Yushi, the scout firing knife, and the story of how a single-shot firearm hidden inside a knife handle became the most concentrated expression of Soviet special operations philosophy is both more technically interesting and more honestly strange than anything the mythology around it suggests. The story begins in the early 1970s with a requirement that the Soviet Ministry of Defense and the KGB issued simultaneously. Both organizations wanted the same thing, for different reasons. The Ministry of Defense needed a weapon for army reconnaissance units, the Spetsnaz teams that would operate behind NATO lines in the event of a European war, conducting sabotage, gathering intelligence, and eliminating specific targets without triggering a general alert. The KGB needed something for operations where even the PSS silent pistol was too identifiable as a weapon if found during a search. The brief as described in the Gunfire primary documentation of the NR series was direct: turn a scout knife into a combined effect weapon, a device that, at a glance, was a knife, a device that, in a crisis, was something else. The first response to this requirement was the NRs, the original scout firing knife, produced in the late 1970s under the design team of R.D. Kleinin at Tula. The NRs fired the 6242 ME SP3 captive piston cartridge, an earlier and slightly less capable version of the silent ammunition family. Its blade was a Bowie-style curved clip-point design, similar to the NR-40 fighting knife that Soviet infantry had carried since the Second World War, with a full-length saw running along the spine. The saw was specifically dimensioned for cutting detonator cord, a sabotage application that tells you exactly what kind of operator the weapon was designed for. Both the NRs and its companion NR, the non-firing version with the same external profile, were produced at the Tula Arms plant, designated 6P25 and 6P25U respectively, ensuring that an observer who saw either knife in a soldier's kit could not reliably distinguish the weapon system from the utility tool. The NRs entered service with Soviet Spetsnaz reconnaissance units and immediately revealed both what the concept could do and where the execution needed work. The SP3 cartridge, while functional, was being phased out of the Soviet silent weapons inventory in favor of the more powerful and more precisely engineered SP4. The blade geometry, while adequate as a fighting knife, had been designed before combat feedback from Afghanistan, refined understanding of how Spetsnaz operators actually use their knives in close-quarters situations. The full-length saw, valuable in theory. caught on clothing and equipment during the stabbing motion in ways that cost critical fractions of a second. The Soviet system's response to these lessons was characteristic, systematic correction, not incremental patch. G.A. Savishchev, I.P., Shedlos, and V.R. Ovchinnikov, 3 engineers at the Tula arms plant, were assigned the redesign. The weapon they produced, and that entered service in 1986, was the NRS-2, designated 6P25U in the Grau Index. The blade changed from clip point to drop point, a shape that presented a smoother profile at the moment of penetration through thick, padded clothing, specifically through the heavy cotton-wadded winter garments that both Soviet and NATO soldiers wore in Central European cold weather. The saw on the spine was shortened, retained for utility purposes including the cutting of detonator cord, but reduced in length to eliminate the snagging problem. The scabbard was entirely redesigned. The insulated wire cutter integrated into it could cut wire up to 2.5 millimeters in diameter, telephone cables up to 5 millimeters, and electrical cables carrying up to 380 volts, the standard voltage of Soviet and European industrial electrical systems. Holes in the scabbard's lace attachment served as a crimping tool for detonator caps. The end of the scabbard incorporated a flat blade screwdriver. In a single piece of kit that attached to a belt and looked like nothing unusual, the designers had packaged a combat knife, a sabotage tool, an electrical cable cutter, a detonator cap crimper, and a single-shot silent firearm. The total weight was 570 grams. The firing mechanism deserves specific examination because it is where the NRS-2 diverges most completely from everything else in the Soviet small arms inventory, and where the design reveals its engineering priorities most honestly. The barrel, 60 millimeters long, rifled, part of a removable barrel and chamber assembly, sits inside the hollow handle pointing in the direction opposite the blade. This is not an oversight. It is the central design decision from which everything else about the weapon's firing procedure follows. To load the NRS-2, the operator depresses the locking lever at the pommel, rotates the barrel assembly to unlock it, pulls it out of the handle cavity, inserts a single SP4 round into the chamber, reinserts the barrel, and rotates it back until the locking lugs engage with an audible click. The flip-up cocking lever on the right side of the handle is then pulled to compress the spring and arm the internal hammer. The safety, a lever beside the barrel protruding from the handle, is moved to the fire position. The weapon is ready. Firing is where the NRS-2 achieves its most genuinely startling characteristic. The IMFDB documentation of the weapon, drawing on examination of physical examples, describes the procedure with admirable directness. Firing requires the user to remove the sheath, flip the knife over so the bulge at the pommel is facing up, and point the blade of the weapon at their own face. The front sight is a post at the base of the handle, the pommel. The rear sight is a notch cut into the guard, the cross guard, which is now at the far end of the weapon from the operator's perspective. The barrel is in the handle is extended toward the target. The operator is holding the blade carefully with both hands, looking down its edge at the sights mounted on what is now the far end of the weapon, with the muzzle pointed away from them and the blade pointed at their face. This is not a comfortable firing position. The modern firearms. Net technical analysis of the NRS family is specific about this. Firing requires a steady two-hand hold and good nerve, because aiming requires the knife to be held with its blade pointing toward the face of the shooter. The effective range is 25 meters with the sheath on. The sheath acting as a forward grip that keeps the operator's hands away from the muzzle end, and the Knifesberg.ru Russian language operational documentation gives the practical aimed fire range as 20 meters. At those distances, a human torso is a large enough target that the rudimentary sights and unconventional hold become adequate. The weapon was never meant for precision shooting. It was meant for one specific situation, a close-range silent kill when every other option has been exhausted or compromised. The round it fires makes the silence claim real rather than approximate. The SP4 captive piston cartridge, developed by the same CIS-NII Tokmash design bureau that produced the NRS-2, originally for the PSA silent pistol, is one of the most technically elegant pieces of ammunition ever manufactured. The Small Arms Defense Journal's testing of the SP4 cartridge system, conducted with instrumented acoustic measurement, recorded an absolute sound pressure level of approximately 122 decibels from the PSS pistol firing the same round. For context, a standard 9mm mine pistol firing produces approximately 160 decibels. A suppressed 22 LR rimfire pistol, considered among the quietest conventional firearms available, produces approximately 120 decibels. The SP4 system achieves near parity with the best suppressed conventional firearms through an entirely different mechanism, one that requires no suppressor, no special equipment, no maintenance of baffles, and no reduction in legal carry capability in jurisdictions that prohibit suppressors while permitting knives. The mechanism itself is a small masterpiece of closed system engineering. Inside the steel cartridge case, behind the cylindrical steel bullet fitted with a brass driving band, sits a cup-shaped piston. Behind the piston is the powder charge. When the primer fires, the burning powder drives the piston forward. The piston pushes the bullet out of the case neck and down the barrel. At the moment the piston reaches the case neck, a retaining crimp stops it cold. The piston is physically arrested before it can exit the case. The bullet continues forward, now free of the piston, and travels down the 60mm rifled barrel toward the target. The propellant gases, still under pressure, are trapped inside the case by the pistons sitting in the neck. They go nowhere. No gas escapes through the muzzle. No gas escapes through the breech. The Small Arms Defense Journal notes that expended SP4 cases may contain pressure for several weeks after firing, and that attempts to disassemble them within a month can be hazardous. The gases stay trapped until the steel case slowly seeps over days and weeks. The result of this containment is that the only sound the weapon produces is the mechanical click of the firing mechanism and the supersonic crack of the bullet if it travels faster than sound, which, at 140 meters per second from the NRS-2's short barrel, it does not. The bullet travels below the speed of sound throughout its flight. There is no sonic crack. There is no muzzle blast. There is no flash. At 20 meters, the SP4 round from the NRS-2 kills reliably. It does so in near silence. Before getting into what the NRS-2's legacy actually is, and why the title of this video, while not literally true, points at something real, if this depth of technical examination is what you watch this channel for, subscribe. It takes one click and helps the channel keep doing primary source research on weapons that mainstream history ignores. Let's talk about what the NRS-2 actually influenced and what it actually wasn't. The modernfirearms.net assessment of the NRS family is honest in a way that the weapons mythology is not, and it is worth quoting directly. While the NRs and NRS-2 might look very spectacular and 007 stylish, in reality they are no more effective as any other combat or utility knife. Firing the NRs requires a steady two-hand hold and good nerve. In most cases, Spetsnaz personnel authorized to issue and use the NRs also have authorization and capability to use much more effective and accurate noiseless pistols in the same calibre, such as the MSP or PS. The reloading procedure is slow. This assessment is accurate and important. The NRS-2 was not a primary weapon for the Spetsnaz units that received it. It was a last resort weapon, an emergency tool, a device for the specific situation, the stripped-down scenario with no other silent option remaining that justified its complexity and its peculiar firing posture. The modernfirearms.net analysis notes that Spetsnaz troops tended to prefer the NR2, the version without the firing mechanism, which replaced the barrel assembly with a cavity for survival equipment. When given the choice between a knife that was heavier and more complex but could fire one shot in silence, and a knife that was simpler and could carry a fire-starting kit and a compass, most operators chose the latter. The NRS-2 was always a specialist item within a specialist community. The title's claim that every Special Forces unit carries it is not literally accurate. the NRS-2 remains in limited service with Russian Spetsnaz and law enforcement special units. As the spotter-up. Comanalysis notes, its appearance in Ukraine suggests Russian or Allied forces still deploy specialized gear from older Spetsnaz inventories, noting that the knife's limited distribution and niche tactical role make its continued appearances in conflict zones both surprising and historically significant. It was never exported widely, no Western Special Forces unit issued it, no NATO country adopted it. The claim in the title is poetic rather than factual, and a rigorous channel handles that honestly. What is accurate is the claim's spirit, and the spirit is about the captive piston cartridge rather than the knife itself. The SP4 and its family are the technology that the NRS-2 helped field and popularize within the Soviet and Russian Special Operations community. The CSA silent pistol uses the same round. The OT's 38 Stechkin silent revolver, a weapon that trades the semi-automatic mechanism for the revolver's simpler reliability, uses the same round in a moon clip. The concept of a firearm that requires no suppressor because the silence is engineered into the ammunition has influenced weapon development globally. The firearmblog.com analysis of captive piston ammunition history notes that the concept itself dates to U.S. patent 692,819 from 1902. Titled Means for Effecting Noiseless Discharge of Guns, the idea predates the Soviet Union. What the Soviet system did was engineer it from a 1902 patent into a functional, producible, serviceable weapons system that could be carried by a single operator in a knife handle. The comparison with Western Special Operations knife design across the same period shows a different philosophy operating in parallel. The American Special Forces carried the Ontario Knife Company's various Oak C3S and similar combat knives, purpose-built fighting blades with no additional mechanisms. The British SAS used the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, a double-edged stabbing weapon of the Second World War era, well into the Cold War period. The German SEC carried various purpose-built combat knives. In every case, the Western philosophy was specialization, a knife that was the best possible knife, a pistol that was the best possible pistol, carried separately and used for their distinct purposes. The Soviet philosophy, at least in the NRS-2, was the opposite. One object that could serve multiple critical functions, none of them at the absolute peak of their respective capability, but all of them adequate, and all of them present in a single 570-gram package on a single belt. This philosophical difference is not simply a product of Cold War political rivalry. It reflects a genuine doctrinal distinction between how Western and Soviet Special Operations forces were expected to operate. NATO Special Operations in the Cold War model emphasized long preparation times, reliable resupply chains, and equipment that could be maintained and replaced. Soviet Spetsnaz doctrine, as described in Viktor Suvorov's accounts of GRU training published in the West after his defection in 1978, assumed extended periods of total isolation from supply, improvised operations using whatever remained available, and a requirement that every piece of kit earn its weight by serving multiple purposes. A knife that was only a knife was, by that standard, a single-purpose tool competing with every other single-purpose tool for space on a soldier who might be carrying everything he needed for 2 weeks behind enemy lines. The scabbard's wire cutter, insulated to 380 volts, is the clearest expression of this philosophy. A NATO Special Operations soldier tasked with cutting a telephone cable would carry specific wire-cutting tools in his equipment. The NRS-2 operator carried the same wire cutter in the sheath of his knife, a piece of equipment he was carrying anyway, that added negligible weight and that could cut the telephone cable, the electrical fence, and, if the primer cap holes were used, prepare the detonator for the demolition charge he carried separately. The designers at Tula were not trying to make the world's best wire cutter, or the world's best knife, or the world's best silent pistol. They were trying to make the most useful 570 grams of metal and polymer that a man operating alone behind enemy lines could hang from his belt. The honest answer to the title's question, whether every Special Forces unit carries it, is that they do not carry the NRs-2, but they carry its lesson. Every modern Special Operations loadout includes tools that combine functions, multi-tools that incorporate wire cutters and screwdrivers and pliers, medical kits that serve dual trauma and survival functions, GPS devices that also serve as communications nodes. The concept of the multifunction tool as a serious military equipment philosophy, not a civilian camping convenience, is something the Soviet Union was engineering into weapons-grade hardware in the early 1970s. The NRs-2 is the sharpest possible expression of that engineering philosophy because it took the most unlikely pairing, a firearm and a knife, two objects that seemed to serve entirely different purposes, and made them coexist in a single 290mm object that served both purposes adequately, without compromising either fatally. The NRs-2 remained in service through the Soviet Union's dissolution and into the Russian Federation's Special Forces inventories carried by Spetsnaz reconnaissance units who understood both what it was for and what it was not. The spotter-up. Comanalysis identifies documented appearances of the knife in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, where its presence in the hands of Russian or Russian-aligned operators more than 3 decades after it entered service confirms what the modern firearms. Net assessment implied it is a specialist item for a specialist situation, but the situation it was designed for remains a real possibility in any deep reconnaissance operation, and the designers who understood that possibility in 1986 understood something about close-quarters covert operations. That has not changed. The captive piston cartridge family continues. The PSS-2, a modernized successor to the PSS silent pistol, entered service with Russian Special Forces in 2011, carrying a new SP-16 cartridge that improved on the SP-4's terminal ballistics while maintaining the same sealed gas principle. The OT's .38 revolver remains in service. The technology that the NRs-2 helped normalize within Soviet and Russian special operations, silent fire without suppressors, achieved through cartridge design rather than barrel modification, has become a mature weapons category rather than an experimental one. Return to that Cold War reconnaissance scenario. The sentry 15 meters away, the failed seal, the knife on the hip that looks like nothing in particular. The operator reverses his grip, holds the blade between his palms, feels the sights align over the sentry's torso, presses the trigger above the safety lever, 122 decibels, quieter than an air conditioning unit, and the operation continues. Whether or not that scenario ever happened precisely as described is not documented in any accessible record. What is documented is that 3 engineers in Tula in the mid-1980s thought it might happen, built the tool to address it, and produced something weighing 570 grams that contained, in the same package, a fighting knife, a saw, a screwdriver function, a wire cutter insulated to 380 volts, a detonator cap crimper, and a single-shot silent firearm. The title calls that useless. The designers called it adequate. Adequate, in Soviet Spetsnaz doctrine, was the highest possible standard.